Hello, good evening. I'm so glad that you all turned out. I did send out a threatening email to many people demanding that they show up for this particular lecture because I just know that Darcy's going to bring it because she always does, every single time, without fail. She is one of the best lecturers I've ever heard, and in our discipline, that's saying something. So I'm just going to read you a little bit. I suppose I should identify myself. My name is Ike Kong. I'm the Deputy Director and Chief Curator here. And this is Art Matters. And we are in a monthly format. Catherine Barth, my assistant, we've been setting up the rest of the calendar year. And we'll continue on that track until probably next calendar year, where we may reduce to an every other month just because my workload is getting a little unbearable. But it is such a great pleasure to be able to bring so many distinguished speakers to you here in Santa Barbara. And I have to admit that almost all of them are my friends. So it's a big and wonderful use of institutional money to keep me entertained. But fortunately, they're almost all incredibly brilliant, and this is no exception. So Darcy Grigsby is the Goldman Distinguished Professor in the Arts and Humanities at the University of California, Berkeley. She's been the recipient of numerous awards throughout her distinguished career, most recently the coveted Clark Prize for Excellence in Arts Writing, which she was awarded in 2018. She is known not only for the superb quality of her art historical writing, but for her dynamism as a beloved teacher at Berkeley, where she's led the department for many years now. Her first book, which was an instant critical success, was Extremities, Painting Empire in Post-Revolutionary France. In 2012, she published another book called, and this is an immensely colossal title. I was just, well, no, I think it's unusual, so I got to read the whole thing. Colossal, Engineering the Suez Canal, Statue of Liberty, Eiffel Tower, and Panama Canal, Transcontinental Ambition in France and the United States in the long 19th century. Thank you very much. And her most recent book is the one about which she's going to lecture tonight. No? Oh, Sojourner. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Okay, sorry, I got that wrong. She also curated an exhibition of her collection of Civil War photographs at the Berkeley Art Museum. So this is the book, which literally is a tome, and it weighs a lot because it's a very, very important and hefty book, and you can buy it at our museum store. Hopefully pretty soon we should be getting copies in, so do keep an eye out for that. So we're so thrilled to welcome Darcy back to Santa Barbara, and I'm sure you're going to find this mesmerizing. She's a force in our discipline, and a reminder to us all of the richness and depth of interpretation that's possible in art history when rigorously practiced to produce brilliant insights. So please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
Hi, everybody. I'm very immunocompromised, but I haven't given any lectures since COVID. I think I'm teaching with a mask on, but it's absolutely exhausting. So let me try not to do that and to say thank you for coming. I appreciate it. And thank you, Ike, for a kind of introduction that's difficult to live up to. I come here to celebrate the fact that this book just appeared in late December. And it is a book that spans maybe, oh, why is that thing there? Go to hell. Sorry. Welcome to my universe. Okay. The earliest part of this book, I think I published a chapter in 2002 and have continued writing chapters for a long time. This book has 9 hefty chapters, and today I'm speaking about Creole secrets that I have in the past last here at this museum because of Ike's incredible, oops, let me get to that. That's not working. Where is it? Huh. Creole Degas. Yeah. 2019, you had me here, and you made comments that I thank you for in this book. And so the cover spans, at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, I will have presented on the middle picture today and the Degas at the far right. So thank you, Ike, for your long-standing support. I'm also curating a show at the Berkeley Art Museum called Alexander Dumas' Afro, Blackness Caricatured, Erased, and Back Again. It opens April 12th, and I invite any of you who happen to be in the Bay Area to come see it. There will be a roundtable on April 29th. I devote one of my chapters to this extraordinary author. But let's start here with today's talk. In 1836, Ingres ordered an encounter between two men who had both been born in Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti. From a distance, the 56-year-old painter exerted his power over a 16-year-old homme de couleur, man of color, and a middle-aged black man, both considered Creoles because of their birth in the colonies. And he orchestrated a confrontation that left both men in ignorance of its ultimate purpose. While residing in Rome as a director of the Académie de France, Ingres wrote to a friend in Paris about something of which he had the greatest need. Find among my students the one who best knows how to do a portrait from a model. And if you don't find anyone better for me, great, I believe I can recommend the young Chassériau. See to it that he keeps this absolutely the greatest secret. He should bar the idol from his studio at this time. Above all, see to it that he copies the type of the individual as closely as possible. Since I have no secrets from you, the subject I want to paint is Christ chasing the devil from the mountain. As for the pupil, Chassériau, he does not need to know this. I want only a simple figure of a Negro in this pose. An undated drawing by Ingres names the model, have this figure painted after the model Joseph Le Nègre, Joseph the Negro. Ingres explicitly named the two Creoles, but his instructions were adamant about the need for secrecy. The student was told not to let anyone know what he was doing, at the same time that he himself was left in total ignorance about Ingres' subject. Théodore Chassériau's teacher was asking him to paint a Negro, not the devil. Was Ingres trying to ensure that he would get a document, not an interpretation? Or did he feel reticent about sharing a subject with his Creole student that literally demonized the black man? The ultimate result of Ingres' commission was Chassériau's famous Étude de Nègre, familiar to many who have never heard of the artist, a painting by a Creole artist of a Creole model. Yet 16-year-old Chassériau delayed fulfilling his obligation to his master. It would take him 17 months to paint the rather modest study of a Negro ordered by Ingres. His delay suggests some reluctance and may have contributed to Ingres' failure ever to realize the painting. The awkward drawing that Ingres made decades later of the never-made painting suggests that the artist had made the right decision. Instead of prioritizing Ingres' request in 1836, young Chassériau, always in fragile health, focused his energies on his artistic debut in the public sphere. When the teenager postponed making the study of Joseph Lenègre, he was refusing to serve his master in order to advance a career that represented the hopes of his entire family. Chassériau's submissions to that year's salon attested to his ambitions as a history painter, and he was rewarded for his efforts. His two moderate-sized history paintings of biblical subjects, The Punishment of Cain and The Return of the Prodigal Son, were accepted along with 4 portraits, including a painting of his younger brother. The subjects were entirely of his own choosing. Awkward, limp, and permeated by melancholy, both of Chassériau's debut history paintings focus on the family. Cain, exiled with his wife and children after his murder of his brother Abel, and a prodigal son finally reunited with his father. In Cain, despairing husband and wife march into a vast, dark, and arid desert accompanied by their 2 distraught young children. Faces are hidden except for the slender, browner child at far left who turns towards us. His anxious, attentive face bears a notable resemblance to that of the other painting's prodigal son, clinging to the gray-haired patriarch cast in shadow. In Chassériau's first salon paintings, we see 2 supplicating sons and 2 fathers whose faces are obscured. And both sons resemble the slender teenager with a long, soulful face who peers out of his self-portrait of 1835, although that face has a slightly lighter complexion. Absent fathers preoccupied the young painter, most especially his own. Chassériau's family had moved to Paris when Théodore was only 1 year old, but his father was constantly in the Caribbean and Latin America. The artist's tender childhood watercolors depict islands in the middle of the page with a single house or church surrounded by water and sky. The young boy imagined his father on an island. In his watercolors, islands promise to draw humans together. Buildings serve to contain and unify the persons inside. Humans may be isolated in the middle of the sea, but they are a unit. In his salon paintings, by contrast, Chassériau painted families that are dispersed or riven, and the landscape does not unite them. While islands symbolize distance and isolation, the expansive landscape could also signify unmooring, the wandering of sorrowful exiles. Chassériau belonged to a colonial family that was subjected, like most colonial families, to continual separations and political as well as financial upheavals. Théodore's family originated in the chaos of revolutionary Haiti. It was born of imprisonment, plantation slavery, racial ambiguity, slave uprising, destruction, embezzlement, and clandestine deals. Théodore's father's long career zigzags across the seas, always accompanied by accusations of misconduct and corruption, leading to his imprisonment. His release from jail by a planter hinged on his marriage to the planter's young daughter, a, quote, girl of color, with whom Benoit had already been, quote, involved. So began Théodore's family. Had Benoit been involved with, or had he abused the teenage girl? Théodore's mother, seen here 3 decades later. The slide from involvement to abuse is, of course, a violence exacerbated by the conditions of slavery and the exploitation of women of color. Théodore's mixed-race mother, Marie Madeleine, exchanged among white men, was 14 years old. Her own mother, Chassériau's grandmother, could have been one of the wealthy planter's slaves or a free woman of color. In either case, Chassériau's mother had been born illegitimate and was descended from slaves. When Benoit died in Puerto Rico in 1844 under a cloud of rumors of further misconduct, possibly by suicide, the Chassériau men in Paris apparently responded by suppressing the facts. A Creole friend wrote, "The gentlemen must know all that, but the ladies know nothing. Not how he died, nor whether he was sick. In any case, everything is kept secret here, and nothing has been leaked by the ministry." By 1844, 25-year-old Théodore would have been one of the gentlemen in the know, withholding information from his mother and sisters. Although his family had moved from Saint-Domingue to Paris when he was only 1, he may, even as a child, have come to know the secrets of his family's history from his 2 older siblings who had left Saint-Domingue with him, but at the ages of 13 and 10. That experience in Saint-Domingue must have been formative of his elder brother Frédéric's politics. Although the Haitian Revolution had destroyed his family's property, Frédéric would become an outspoken abolitionist and historian, publishing an immense tome, The Abolition of Slavery in the English Colonies, both in French and in English, in 1841. Despite or because of the family's fragmentation, its immigration to Paris from the colonies, and its Creole identification, the Chassériau family was very closely, perhaps unhealthily, bonded. In Frédéric's words, living together entirely in our interior. Little surprise then that the impoverished and sequestered, sickly teenage painter devoted himself to making portraits of his family. Of 8 pictures painted in 1835, 6 are portraits of Chassériau's. Across these, there is a marked resemblance among the mother and her children. The father is most unlike. The children share the mother's thick black hair, large, wide-set eyes, black, heavily lidded, and almond-shaped, long oval faces coming to a point at a chin punctuated by a cleft. In separate portraits, Chassériau was establishing a connection among his family members. Their unification was based on resemblance and on his authorship as a painter. His father remained askew from the others, less vivid and also less like. He did not return his son's gaze. Chassériau was not only teaching himself how to paint, he was also consolidating his family's filiation and claiming a special role as its archivist. Yet there are few portraits of the painter himself. After Chassériau's death, the photographer Nadar was astonished to realize that he had never taken his portrait. He offered hypotheses, perhaps Chassériau's reserve or delicacy or his discretion, and the words are all Nadar's, stopped him. Or perhaps he was reluctant because contemporaries, including his first Creole lover, described Théodore as very ugly, often in racialized language. Victor Hugo claimed another mistress, a celebrated beauty, had not only called Chassériau ugly, but a South American monkey, a sapajou. The racist euphemisms were far from subtle. Astonishingly, recent scholars have repeated the view that Chassériau was ugly with little self-consciousness about the ways the term was historically bound up with racial hierarchies. On the basis of this late portrait of the older Chassériau by Masson, the 2002 French catalogue concludes that the Creole painter's dark complexion and ugliness may have contributed to his reluctance to be portrayed, even claiming that he, quote, did not hide the unattractiveness of his face in his self-portrait of 1835. Such comments are not only unthinking, but blind. The boys who appear in the history paintings and the 1835 self-portrait are young, slender, vulnerable, melancholic, and soulfully large-eyed. They are lovely romantic youths, but they may indeed have been seen as brown. Nevertheless, in 1835 and 1838, young Chassériau boldly chose to look himself in the eye and offer an interpretation of what he saw. The teenager may have been self-conscious about his appearance as a Creole man of color, but as a teenager, he chose to paint his self-portrait twice. He would never do so again. When Chassériau first painted himself, he did so in the context of portraying his siblings and mother and tethering the subject of family crisis to the highest genre of history painting. In his first self-portrait, Chassériau resembles his mother, sisters, and brothers, although he barely inscribes the family's distinctive cleft chin, replacing it instead by a face riven in two by light and dark. An undated drawing by Ingres precisely stipulates what he wanted. The simple but clearly outlined sketch of an awkwardly splayed male nude is surrounded by written instructions. First, square the figure exactly for the transfer to the canvas. Have this figure painted after the model Joseph Lenègre. His size, studio figure. The white or gray canvas will serve as background. The light coming from left to right. Request the most exact likeness of the model with the most correct rendering of the forms and his color. Closely observe this top and curved line. Repeat and paint separately a clenched fist, and without moving the arm, the hand in a relaxed position. Ingres emphasizes the pose, but not the purpose. As we have seen, the study of Joseph was intentionally deprived of all narrative context. Chassériau was being asked to paint Joseph in a vacuum. But Joseph's black body provided its own narrative import, and that narrative was also familial. It concerned slavery and the recent Haitian Revolution. Slavery haunted the painter's family history in Saint-Domingue, both as the slaves owned by his father and his grandfather, and as the ancestors on his maternal side, the origin of his mother's color. The black body was the family's repressed, or its secret. Ingres never acknowledged the strangeness of the encounter between Creoles that he had orchestrated. Instead, he was thinking pragmatically. As an artist long accustomed to posing models in the studio, on the drawing, he indicates where to place 4 supports, appui, for the model, at each foot, the knee, and the elbow at right. Yet Ingres wanted to pose a model who appeared to be falling through space. These were antithetical goals. Models cannot be arrested in mid-flight. The awkwardness of his figure's pose partly derives from the tension between its theatrically outstretched display and its conception as a feasible distribution of physical weights, limbs, torso, head, on the platform of a studio. What could the model's body do, and what could it withstand? How could the model be extended in unanticipated ways, but be adequately buttressed or braced so as to hold a pose for hours at a time? Ropes, pulleys, and wooden boxes were standard tools of the studio. If you look carefully, you can see them in most 18th to mid-19th century paintings of ateliers across Europe, often holding up arms. A 1789 painting of a dying Saint Sebastian by David's student Fabre reveals that martyrdom and modeling were a good fit. Martyr and model have a hand tied up by a rope. A 19th century commentator described the life-threatening challenges for the model posing as a criminal hanging from a noose, only for 30 seconds at a time. Characterists also mocked the abjection endured by models strapped up, arranged on wooden boxes, subjected to painful physical constraints, and sexualized. The artist's greatest challenge was to pose models so as to imply movement or a defiance of gravity. One painter later recalled that in order to pose his model in the act of plunging into the river, he had rigged up a tackle which, hanging from the ceiling, caught the model at the waist and thus half suspended her. If diving is a simple fluid action, having a model recreated in the studio proved extraordinarily difficult. Paradoxically, it was free movement, not stasis, that required a greater subjection of the model to physical constraints. And Ingres wanted a picture of a Black man falling through space from the top of a mountain. Joseph would have been a desired model because of his athletic versatility. According to one commentator writing in 1840, only a couple of years after Chassériau completed this study, Joseph had been working as an acrobat when he was plucked off the street by Géricault to pose for the Raft of the Medusa of 1819. Let an artist meet in the street a man with strongly accentuated male features, an expressive physiognomy, an athletic bearing. This is how Géricault recruited among the actors of Madame Saki the Negro Joseph, who, having moved from Saint-Domingue to Marseille and from Marseille to Paris, was hired by the acrobatic troupe to play Africans. The Raft of the Medusa sent numerous clientele to Joseph, and his large shoulders and tapering torso kept them. Not surprisingly, other models resented Joseph's popularity. Cadamour was a famous Italian model, a favorite of David, who felt devalued once he was forced to move to Gros Studio after David's exile in 1814. The resentful model refused to model with Jews and at the same time entered into a holy wrath against Géricault, who had such a predilection for a Negro that he placed him in all his paintings. A Negro is not so beautiful, he said. But what does the Negro of Géricault have to do with you, asked Gros. Oh, Monsieur Baron, David never put in a Negro, and yet he was a painter. Cadamour was right. David never put in a Negro, and yet he was a painter. But the era of David's classical heroes had passed. Napoleon and colonialism were partly to blame. So too were their aesthetic corollaries, Orientalism and exoticism and Romanticism's embrace of the ugly. Cadamour prided himself in his power of assimilation. Ask him to model for Leonidas, and he became Leonidas, or Brutus, or a martyred saint. According to Cadamour, Joseph always remained a Negro, and he resented that he was so sought after. Joseph was not able to disappear into Brutus. Indeed, this is the joke of John Boyne's A Meeting of Connoisseurs of 1807, which mocks having a muscular, half-naked Black man pose for the Apollo Belvedere. Still, Cadamour could not pose as a Black man, and Black models were now popular. Here is the flip side of Boyne's joke. The Black model is so much more mesmerizing than the vague, wispy representation of the Apollo Belvedere on the canvas. He, not Greco-Roman sculpture, rivets the attention of the foolish, ugly, leering British artists and connoisseurs, as well as our own. Cadamour was being eclipsed. Joseph was appointed a regular salaried model at the École des Beaux-Arts in 1832, hired by two of David's students, Ingres and Gros. Another contemporary account celebrates Joseph's admirable beauty, as well as his crucial role in the making of the Raft of the Medusa. Uniquely, Joseph had, quote, braved the infection of cadavers that the artist, Géricault, had assembled in his atelier. He had remained alone with him during the great period of time that the painter had used to execute his work. Géricault famously painted Joseph's soulful portrait in uniform and his beautiful broad back in a preliminary oil sketch. Today, however, I wish to draw attention to the poses Joseph was asked to assume in Géricault's studio. In the final painting, the black man rises triumphantly because the swelling collective of suffering and dying men support him from below. But in the act of posing, Joseph would have been supported not from below, but from above by a rope, which held him as he fell back, his legs braced against the tilted wooden surface that became the top of the barrel. Look at a detail of a preparatory oil sketch. A rope would also have held up the hand of the model posing for the white figure to the right. Contra Cadamore, this figure too could have been modeled by Joseph. Here, whiteness is constituted merely by the choice not to add color. In the completed painting, the swaths of beautifully twisting fabric hide what the oil study reveals, the slightness of men's arms held up against an overwhelming void, arms held up with ropes. Étude de Nègre. Whoops. Oh, I never print out two-sided when I give a talk, but I did, and I'm paying for it. Ropes can be seen in several of Géricault's quick ink sketches, all called trapezistes or acrobats. While Géricault does not emphasize these figures' race, Joseph was very likely Géricault's acrobat. After all, this was his profession. Joseph was proficient in the use of ropes to create airborne spectacles. He knew how to defy gravity. Still, movement was not the purview of grand history painting in 19th century France. Models were not imagined as acrobats who used ropes to take flight. Rather, ropes in the art studio were intended to hold models still, to fix them, to lock them in place. Ingres had ordered an encounter between a teenage Creole painter born in Saint-Domingue of delicate health and described as ugly and reserved, and a middle-aged, charismatic, extroverted, athletic black man repeatedly described as beautiful and also as a raconteur, who was also born in Saint-Domingue and who was, moreover, intimately tied to the celebrated abolitionist French painter. We know that young Chassériau was a great admirer of Géricault, but Joseph was the one who had been intimate with him. Indeed, Joseph was one of the few living witnesses to the making of the era's greatest abolitionist picture. Joseph alone knew the painting before, during, and after its completion. He was not a viewer forever outside of and after the finished work. That was Chassériau's role, to be belated and remote from the heroic painterly event. The only evidence that Chassériau was honored or overwhelmed by the prospect of following in Géricault's footsteps by painting his favorite model was his procrastination. When he finally sent the sketch to Ingres 17 months later, he assumed a submissive and apologetic tone in a note. The painter also shifted the blame for the long delay onto Joseph. I very much hope that you find it passable. It remains for me to ask for all of your indulgence, having taken so long, but I had quite a bit of trouble with the model, who found the pose awfully tiring and did not want to keep posing without break. The teenage painter does not refer to Joseph by his name. He's simply the model. In the next line, he calls him the Negro. Worse yet, he conflates Joseph with his representation. For a while, I was hoping to be able to come and bring you the Negro myself, but I am not free yet. My mother is still in Paris, and I am obliged to postpone going to Italy straight away, despite my great wish to see you again and to hear you give me strength. This sentence has repeatedly been translated as I was hoping to bring you the study of the Negro myself, but Chassériau, still 17, had not written the word étude. Instead, somewhat cavalierly, he had said he had hoped to deliver Le Nègre to his master, Ingres, but he was not yet free purportedly of his mother. The wording is overdetermined and disturbing. The Negro can be conflated with the transportable object like the slave, but Chassériau construes the painter, not the model, as lacking the freedom to move. Étude de Nègre throws the black man off the land or the cliff or the island into a void, exile. It also undresses and dislocates him, implying his fragmentation in the two eerily disembodied but large and powerful hands that we see irrationally as his own. Joseph torn apart like slaves. Put Chassériau's picture next to William Blake's earlier anti-slavery illustrations and recognize the disquieting resemblances, the spectacle of black bodies at once splayed and painfully arrested, and in Blake's case, is explicitly tortured. A hook produces the elegant silhouette of a Negro hung alive. A severed hand nonchalantly lies on the ground of breaking on the rack. Could the son of a former slave owner and colonial administrator, could the son of a woman of color and descendant, therefore, of slaves, could the brother of an important abolitionist, could this boy man paint Joseph without an awareness that his body signified slavery? Perhaps. He was, after all, only 17. Yet the Étude de Nègre offers, while inscribed by slavery, also releases the beautiful black man from the rocky ground and sets him catapulting through a vast blue. Ingres had said the white or gray canvas will serve as background. The blue had been Chassériau's idea, and it makes all the difference. It turns the study of the model into a narrative, and it makes Joseph simply magnificent and very beautiful. Blue makes his darkness a color, red browns and gray browns and dark browns and yellow browns, and it makes his heels beige and his fingernails peach-colored, his lower lip a slash of pink red, his upper lip dark brown lined with vermilion, his hair dark gray. Ingres had stipulated that he wanted the most correct rendering of the forms and his color. Chassériau heightened the warmth and intensity of Joseph's color by setting it against its coloristic foil, blue. He had placed complexion in a context. Intuitively, he knew that color relies on relation. The blue is also crucial because it suggests living circumstances, movement in space, rather than the stasis of a model posed in the studio or a slave hanging from a hook. Blue, sky, air, introduces movement and thus narrative and also fantasy. Against blue, we can see Joseph flying rather than falling, as if released into a future while alert to his past, pursing his eyebrows at the perpetrator of his fall, but so strong and whole that he appears unassailable, perhaps unreachable. Chassériau's father was part of France's colonial machine, and he had owned slaves. Chassériau's brother was an abolitionist, especially concerned with post-emancipation, what happens after abolition. In the Étude de Nègre, the very body of Joseph is split between such negative and positive constructions. The lower arm and leg are bent awkwardly so as to emphasize the sharp angles of elbow and knee. These limbs appear rigid, compressed into a small space, confined. The upper body, by contrast, is all extension, outstretched arm and leg, suggestive of the acrobat's elasticity, the freedman's mobility. Yet the way the upper foot is crooked onto the rock appears uncomfortable, even painful. Release is promised by the extension into the sky, but has not yet fully been achieved. Still, we can see Joseph freed, as if tumbling out of the history of slavery into an unknown future. Perhaps more pessimistically, he resembles Alexandre Dumas Pére's mixed-race protagonist George in his only colonial novel. I hate double-sided talks. In 1843, Dumas, the man of color whose father was born in Saint-Domingue, writes of George's placelessness. We have the sea, the space, the immensity. Every land is an enemy to us, so we need our wings first and foremost. In Chassériau's picture, we can see the black man's freedom, but only insofar as he is exiled, expatriated. Cane at sea, cane falling. Or conversely, we can see the traces of his subjection, his confinement, the physical constraints, even torture, experienced in perpetuity by slaves and temporarily by models. The vision of his emancipation required not only the suppression of the ways his body had been constrained by boxes and ropes, but also the overlooking of the disturbing cut-off hands. Let me be clear here. The difference between the conditions of slavery and modeling cannot be overstated. Yet in representation, the slave's body and the model's body bear similarities that are typically repressed in history painting. History painting is predicated on the suppression of the viewer's awareness of the subjection of the models who posed for it. But Chassériau's Étude de Nègre, made when slavery still existed in France's colonies other than Saint-Domingue, is a picture in which the naked black man as model necessarily connoted the naked black man as slave. Both were defined as bodies to be manipulated at will by whites, as bodies whose labor was predicated on utter subjection. Still, Joseph was performing the permanent subjugation of slaves. As a wage earner, he was performing the slave body. According to Chassériau, Joseph found, quote, the pose awfully tiring and did not want to keep posing without break. The model's insistence on breaks from posing signified his status as a paid worker rather than a slave. Still, Chassériau chose to depict Joseph as if he had not been subjected to the prolonged, sometimes painful act of modeling, as in so much painting, the ropes and boxes were taken away. Joseph was not intended to be seen as a modern wage earner, but as a slave, or, little did he know, as a devil. The act of modeling had to be suppressed. Look at a tracing that Chassériau made the day before he sent the canvas to Ingres in Rome. Here the ropes are absented, but we see the wooden boxes upon which Joseph leaned his elbow at right and his upper foot. The sheet of paper is too small for the length of the outstretched leg, so Chassériau lets the left edge crop it, adding the cut-off foot below. The drawing was clearly meant to provide the artist with a record of his painting, but Chassériau did not value it enough to find the requisite size paper. In the process, Joseph's body was even further taken apart. Yet this drawing and the final canvas betray an interest in Joseph on Chassériau's part that exceeded the requirements of Ingres' commission. Both study and painting carefully attend to Joseph's face, and both bear a striking resemblance to Géricault's drawing of Joseph almost 20 years earlier. Ingres, by contrast, never focused on the face of his imagined devil. In 1838, Chassériau was still a portraitist above all. He looked at Joseph and he saw his particular facial features. Does Joseph's distinct individuality matter here? Ingres himself had been confused about what he wanted when he ordered the study. Ingres had strung together the words portrait, model, copy, type, and individual when he commissioned the study of a specific black man he called by name, a model he knew very well and had even hired as a regular model at the École des Beaux-Arts 4 years earlier. The École's minutes indicate that Joseph had no surname. This alone implies that he may have been born a slave. Could such a man be the self-possessed sitter of a portrait? Or was he always a model who shared the condition of anonymity and interchangeability with slaves? Joseph was painted repeatedly by French artists. But I would argue that the face in Études de Nègre and in Géricault's ink drawing of Joseph in rotation, each with their distinctive and similar open faces, each with their emphasis on his mobility and athleticism, I would argue that these offer our best glimpse of the specific man who modeled, a portrait of a model. The year Chassériau finally completed Études de Nègre, he also painted his second and final self-portrait. While monochromatic and lightly sketched, this later painting is far more complex and confident. Although only 17 or 18, the painter appears older and bonier. Deeper shadows encircle his eyes, making him appear even more soulful. Most significantly, Chassériau now shows himself as a practicing artist in his studio, not a young gentleman in a bourgeois interior with his vocation shyly peeking out from the picture's far left top corner. In 1838, Théodore is dressed in a smock and holds his large rectangular palette, maul stick, and long brushes between himself and the viewer. The large canvas at right further walls him into his space of the studio and walls us out. The first self-portrait implies a desire to join the society outside its frame, to be accepted. The second is a confident assertion of proprietary claim to the practice of art, to the act of painting in progress. Perhaps the second portrait derives its power from the way it manages to sequester a space of some autonomy for Théodore, a space outside his family, outside his reliance on his siblings as models, a space of some imagined self-sufficiency. And this space is not familial, but art historical. Théodore, a Creole man of color, stands framed by the European canon, contemplating and creating himself. He stands in the very history of art, wedged between the revered biblical and classical bodies of the European artistic tradition. A draped woman, his own picture of the Virgin, rejected that very year from the Salon, and a classical male nude whose status as a sculpture or as a painting remains ambiguous. Holding a club, the male nude appears to be a young and beardless Heracles after he had defeated the Nemean lion. Likening himself to Heracles at the earliest stage of his 12 labors, Chassériau suggests that he's beginning an arduous, but what will be ultimately a successful process. Here is a self-portrait by a mixed-race Creole in Paris, a man whose ancestors were slaves and planters and colonial officials, whether he wished to admit this or not. Admit this he did, perhaps unconsciously. Unnoted in the scholarship is Heracles' strangely blackened face. There's no antique precedent for such a move. The silhouetted profile is Grecian, not Joseph's, but it is inexplicably black, an eruption of the repressed, or the mark of Cain on the classical figure. Cain, after all, had been Chassériau's first heroic, indeed Herculean, male nude. In fact, the Cain of 1836 and the Heracles of 1838 share a marked resemblance. Look especially at the bend of the neck and the likeness of the neck, shoulder, and large upper arm, the bend of the head, all similarly cast in light. And both of these muscular white nudes bear blackened faces. Cain's fate was to be marked by God both as a sign of his punishment for fratricide and as a sign that he was not to be killed. Genesis recounts that, quote, the Lord put a mark on Cain. But in France, as early as the 18th century, that mark came to be interpreted as the curse of blackness on Cain, from whom all blacks are descended. In his early history painting of the subject, Chassériau alluded to the biblical text by turning Cain's head away, suggesting it might bear a mark to which we do not have access, but he also darkened the entire face as if it is merely cast in the deep shadow that also obscures the far side of his upper torso. In 1836, instead of painting the Étude de Nègre for Ingres as ordered, Chassériau painted a white man bearing a black face, a darkened face that may be caused by lighting conditions or may bear a mark connotative of racial blackness as well as shame. This illusion of a face cast in shadow is an achievement of his early history painting. But in his late self-portrait, the abrupt black face on the classical white male nude appears a flattened mask, a family secret, a persistent ancestor. Remember that Chassériau's father accompanied General Leclerc to Saint-Domingue to kill rebel slaves. Remember that Chassériau's mother was descended from slaves. Remember that Chassériau's brother fought for the emancipation of slaves. In his last self-portrait, made the same year that he painted Joseph expelled from the land into a vast blue unknown, the young Creole painter fashioned himself as a French artist. Yet his conflicted colonial past, his mixed race, his family's contradictory relationship to slavery come into view as the flat black shape that disrupts French art's normative illusionism, a mark that lingered. Thank you.